What's up guys, my name is Marc Steiner and today we're going to be reviewing the Sony 100mm f2.8 STF. Let's get right into it. So when you think about 100mm, you usually think about macro lenses. That's the first thing that came to my mind, the Canon 100mm f2.8. But this is in fact not a macro lens. This right here has been dubbed the Bokeh King of all lenses. And when I heard about this lens being released a couple of years ago, I was so excited and I was so hyped for this kind of lens to exist because me being a portrait photographer, I'm all about that bokeh. But then to my surprise, not a lot of people covered this lens, nor do I see it out in the field, nor did it really have this cult following that I was anticipating for something to be called the Bokeh King. Before I say anything else, Sony did lend me this lens for 2 weeks to test out. This in no way is going to impact the actual review. I'm still going to give you the full honest review of this lens. So when Sony sent me this lens, I was very excited to test this thing out because I wanted to see how it worked in the real world and why not many people have been using this lens, especially since the 135 1.8 was just released, and that I think would give this lens a run for its money. So let's start off with build quality. This lens is built very well. It has a nice custom button, which is found on a lot of good Sony lenses. It has a lot of clicky buttons for AF/MF, for the on-off of the optical steady shot, as well as the declicker, which I find very helpful. The aperture ring on this thing is so fun to play with, both in click mode and declick mode. It's just so satisfying to do it, but it is kind of weird that I couldn't adjust the aperture on the body. I could only do it on the lens, so that kind of irked me. But because it's so satisfying to turn, I had no problem with that. The focus ring, on the other hand, is not a joy to move whatsoever. It's really loose, and that's coming from a guy who's been using Sony lenses. All the Sony focus rings are electronic, not manual, so there's always a little bit less give than a manual focus. But this is just really loose, there's no give whatsoever. I can slide it with one finger, no problem, like I'm a DJ. That shouldn't be happening on this caliber of a lens. And although this lens is pretty hefty and built like a tank, it's not as hefty as I thought it would be, especially after handling the 85 1.4 G Master. The optical steady shot on this thing is great, and I think it's the only other G Master aside from the 70-200 that has OSS built in, which is super helpful, and it works in tandem with the in-body stabilization in my A7R3, which just makes everything easier and smoother, especially when you're shooting handheld. What about the autofocus? The eye autofocus on this lens works like a charm. This is post 3.0 update, so we're getting that better autofocus, but even with the update, I was still impressed with how it tracked the eyes, especially with Ken moving all over the place. It did a really good job, just caught up to him, and for a lens with this much glass in it, I was really impressed at how fast it was able to catch focus and keep him in focus. This definitely was on the same level as the 85 1.4 G Master, and I was really impressed with this. Video AF was equally as impressive, if not more impressive. For me, I was mind blown by how cinematic this lens focuses. There was not a hitch in this lens while it was tracking the subject moving away from the camera or coming towards the camera, which are two of the most difficult things for a camera to track. So it's all the more impressive for me as a filmmaker to see how well this lens tracks, because I can completely rely on this for moving shots like this. However, when Ken moves out of frame and then comes back into frame, it struggles greatly, and it doesn't even attempt to get him. There's a slight attempt, but it doesn't actually get him in focus until he comes back into frame and then stops moving. For this last test, I had Ken run towards camera at full speed, and the lens does a superb job of tracking him. There is no lag whatsoever, and I am so impressed with how this lens focuses on a moving subject. This lens is plenty sharp. I found it to be as good as the 85 G Master, which is a good thing, although I found it to be sharper on the close focus distance than on the further focus distance. This lens is literally advertised as a 2.8, and it says so on the front of this lens and on the box and all of the paperwork, but it's a T5.6, and if you don't understand the difference between f-stops and t-stops, The general idea is that t-stops are more for cinema cameras, and it's a more direct reflection of how much light is actually hitting the sensor versus how wide your aperture can go. So what t5.6 means is that you're actually letting in a lot less light than you would be at f2.8. Now you might be wondering, why would I buy a 2.8 lens if it's not actually letting in the amount of light it should be? And the reason why is because of this apodization element in the lens. This is what gives the lens its whole character. This is why this lens exists, literally because of this one element, the apodization filter. Now what this lens element actually does is that it cuts out a lot of light coming into the lens, which is why it's a t5.6. But in exchange, you get crispy, clean, smooth bokeh that you don't get on other lenses. And in my testing, I found this to be very true. This filter does a very good job of giving you that pleasing, smooth bokeh, but where it really shines is with lights, like actual light, not sunlight. I'm talking about light bulbs, like car lights or street lamps. That is where this thing really shines. So if you live in an urban environment with like a downtown scene and there are lights, this thing is going to excel. My friend Ken busted out his fairy lights, and as you can see, it's just so smooth, so circular, so creamy, and this is really where this lens absolutely kills it. I was also really impressed with how this lens handled backlighting and flaring. But the same thing that's making this lens excel in certain areas is also hindering it in those same areas. Now, what do I mean by that? Because of that apodization filter, you're letting in so much less light, and this lens would thrive at like blue hour, dusk, night photography. But because you're getting t5.6, at a base level ISO, I was shooting like golden hour, blue hour, and I was shooting at ISO 1000 just to get a mild exposure. So because of that, if you're a natural light shooter like me, this lens is kind of out of the question if you're doing anything past golden hour, which is where it would shine because street lamps and everything start to turn on after golden hour. So I was getting really bummed because I didn't want to push the ISO that high. Sure, I have a newer camera and it can handle that kind of stuff, but I don't like pushing that in that situation, especially when I can throw on an 85-1.8 or a 35-1.4 and shoot between ISO 100 and ISO 800 in pretty much every situation and be completely fine with it. But to get just like a base ISO 1000 just to get some sort of exposure that's recoverable in Photoshop, that kind of irked me. If you're not a natural light photographer like me and you use flash on a regular basis and you use it in tandem with this lens, you're gonna have no problem whatsoever. Also, we talked about how this lens excels with lights, but if you're not shooting lights, I really actually didn't like how the bokeh was rendered in this lens. It's very flat, it's blurred perfectly, don't get me wrong, but it just doesn't have character. It's very smooth, very symmetrical, very flattering, very consistent. If you want that consistent look, this is a great lens for that. But since I'm mostly doing portraiture, I really like the character of my 35-1.4, of my 85-1.8. Those bokeh, like doesn't require lights to look good. It can blur out the background and look good in any situation. Whereas with this one, to me, it felt like a very high quality iPhone portrait mode photo. And that, if I'm investing that much money in a lens, it should not feel like a high quality iPhone photo. It should look like a high quality mirrorless camera photo. Here's what I mean. If we look at the 100mm, the bokeh looks much flatter, more muted, whereas in the 85mm, there are obvious bokeh balls all over the place. This is most noticeable in the tree, where it looks like a blotch of light in the 100mm, but there are circular bokeh balls in the 85. It definitely comes down to personal preference. And so because of that, I just started using my 85 in those situations where I would be using the 100mm. And I prefer the shots coming from the 85 because I really like the way that it renders the background more. This lens also comes with a focus limiter, so you can dictate what the minimum focusing distance is of this lens from situation to situation. Now, that might sound like it's coming in super handy and you can get some like macro looking shots, but this is nowhere near 1:1 and this is not a macro lens. So if you're thinking about that in your mind, don't get this lens for macro photography whatsoever. It was, however, very fun to play with a different minimum focusing distance depending on the situation. However, if I wasn't doing any macro-like shots, I was always staying in the 85 to infinity range because there was no need to go into anything closer. It was, however, kind of annoying to switch between these two minimum focusing distances because when I'm I'm doing some close-up shots, I kind of just want to whip out my camera and continue taking photos. But I was like, why is nothing in focus? It's refusing to focus. And then I realized I'm further away than the minimum focusing distance that's allowing me to do. I have to switch it back over. And so that kind of got tedious when it happened. And I just wish that this had one minimum focusing distance that just covered everything instead of having two different ones. This, however, is where price comes into the equation. This lens is $1,500. And if you're in the market willing to spend that amount of money, there are better options out there. I would much prefer the 85 1.4 G Master over this lens, and although I haven't had the opportunity to test the 135 1.8 yet, I definitely would recommend that one over this one for most circumstances. This is a very niche, specialized lens, and if you're that kind of person who wants that, it's great. But if you're like me and you're a natural light photographer and you want a lens that's not going to be reliant on having flash or being limited in low light situations like that, this is probably not the lens for you. I will say in terms of video though, I really did like this lens. It's a great focal length for a lot of interesting shots because of the optical image stabilization, especially when paired with a brand new Sony camera with in-body image stabilization, you can get some pretty smooth handheld footage. And because of that apodization filter, it kind of works as an in-body ND filter that's really high quality. So I was able to get some nice daylight shots which didn't require me to have an ND filter on top of it. So if you're a video shooter, this is an interesting lens. I still probably wouldn't recommend it. There are better things out there, but I would definitely recommend this more for video than I would for photo. So with all that being said, let me know what you guys think about this lens. Do you already own this lens? Are you thinking about buying this lens and we're on the fence? Are you going to buy a different lens because of my review of this lens? Let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts. My name has been Marc Steiner, and I will see you next time. What's up, guys? So I'm here with my friend Ken, and we've been damn it, Ken. So close. All right. You're gonna get me again with that, aren't you?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think we're good.
Yeah.